David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, as well as the former UK Foreign Minister. David, welcome to Quicktake. Your organization singularly focused on providing food, medical care, and support to refugee families who are fleeing. It feels like we've entered a new phase of this war, with Russia widening its attack, moving into small cities, not long after attacking the hospital complex in Mariupol and other civilian infrastructure. My question to you is, what does this evolution in strategy do to the existing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine?
Yes, I think you're right to say that we're reaching a new phase. I think there are two key aspects to it. The first is the people who are in besieged cities, many of them unable to get out because either they are surrounded or because they're elderly, they're disabled, they just can't move. And so there is a new humanitarian challenge as regards the Ukraine crisis about how to reach those people. It's not new for humanitarians. We know this in the history of war. There's always been the need to reach civilians who are stuck. The second aspect is civilians who are on the run elsewhere to the west, generally in Ukraine. Many of the media pieces have been about those who've reached Europe, understandably, 2 million, but they're safe. They're generally the women and the children because the men are being conscripted. But inside Ukraine, you've got a large number of people who are on the move inside the country, and they need support as well. And that's why organizations like the International Rescue Committee are so committed to getting not just our own people on the ground, but perhaps more important, working to support NGOs, Ukrainian non-governmental organizations, charities, especially in healthcare, especially to support kids who are traumatized by what's going on, never mind endangered by it.
I know, David, that you have said access to aid is a right under international humanitarian law. Humanitarian corridors are supposed to be one way for people, civilians, to leave the country safely or get from one part of the country to another. How are these humanitarian corridors supposed to work versus what is happening in Ukraine right now?
Well, the way they're supposed to work is that people who want to get out are able to get out without fear for their lives. And that's not the case at the moment because of too many cases widely reported in the media where people who were getting out, civilians, you've seen them, terrible pictures of just mothers with kids and a couple of suitcases, have been hit by mortar shells and by others now, and by other forms of artillery. So there is enormous fear on the ground. The humanitarian corridor discussion is riddled with doublespeak, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And it's very, very important that we understand that the right to aid in your own home in your own hometown is a legal right in international law, as is the right not to be targeted. Whatever the excuses, even when combatants say that there were military facilities nearby, that is no excuse for hitting a civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, but we're dealing with a Russia that it looks like is not respecting or abiding by this law or any international laws up until this point during this war. How do you address that? How do you speak to them and appeal to them to do the right thing?
Well, appeal probably is a good word at the moment. Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's a signatory to the UN Charter. It's a signatory to the Geneva Conventions on the Conduct of War. It's not actually a member of the International Criminal Court, nor is the United States actually, which has announced investigations of war crimes that are taking place in Ukraine at the moment. And the prospects for Ukrainian civilians are obviously bleak, not least because we've seen this movie before. The bombardment, the pulverization tactics that are being used in Mariupol, you mentioned, and elsewhere, have been seen in Syria, in the town of Aleppo, in the city of Aleppo, in Grozny, in Chechnya. So I'm afraid that the willingness of Russian commanders to use the most blitzkrieg tactics has been well documented before. That isn't to say that it's not important to document it now.
Yeah.
Because it's not for me to judge whether or not there are war crimes, but there's prima facie evidence that there are war crimes taking place. That's why the International Criminal Court has launched its inquiry.
I mean, there's a cliche that history repeats itself, but when it actually does repeat itself, it's pretty depressing. Let's talk about that war crime idea, because documenting the incident, such as the targeting of the hospital complex and the maternity ward in Mariupol as a war crime, is something that we are all concerned with. And it is certainly a step. But what happens now that that step has been taken and people have claimed it as a war crime or have denounced it as a war crime. Why is it so significant to do so when Russia is not following any rules and operates under its own rules?
Well, the danger is not just in respect of Russia, but more widely in the world at the moment. There is an age of impunity. The idea that military commanders can get away with anything. And because they can get away with anything, they do anything, including the targeting of civilians. The documentation is very important. The prosecutions, where appropriate, is very important. In a case recently in the German courts, Syrian generals were found guilty of war crimes under the global principle of what's called universal jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't want anyone to think that this is an easy answer. We're living with very deep, big political forces, and the abuse of power by those with power involves the deployment of very significant resources. So there's no glib or easy answer to this. But what I think we do know 2 weeks into this war, as we enter the third week, is first of all, the Ukrainian resistance has been much stronger than many people expected. Secondly, that the unity of the European continent with the United States has been much stronger than many people expected. And the global reaction has been much swifter and more significant, including from the private sector. And this, I'm afraid, is going to be a long struggle. But the defense of the rights of civilians in war is absolutely fundamental to humanity.
Thank you for answering that. Let's turn now to the refugees who do make it out of Ukraine and are now trying to resettle somewhere else. The UN says 2.5 million people have fled the country since the invasion, and we know that up to 1.5 million have entered through Poland alone. You've said one of the lessons out of Syria is that you cannot rely on the countries closest to the crisis to absorb and bear the greatest burden. In this case, we're talking about Poland, for instance. How would you grade the rest of Europe and the U.S.'s willingness to step up and take in refugees?
Well, I think we can give Europe a pretty good grade, frankly. All 27 European countries have said that every Ukrainian automatically gets 3 years residence, 3 years right to work, 3 years access to services, including education services for their kids. So the European 27, the 27 member state countries of the European Union, have stepped up pretty well. The next step is to make sure that there's financial support for countries that are bearing the greatest load. That's notably Poland, Hungary. But there are also countries outside the European Union. So Moldova is a good example, where there's going to be need for European aid. But the EU response has been pretty good. I think that the US, the UK can do more on the refugee front. But obviously, 90+% of the refugees are going to stay within the European continent. And they've got their rights properly administered at the moment. There's now a practical job because the numbers are huge, 2.5 million, as you say, probably 5 million before this is done with. Pretty much all of them women and children because the men are staying. And there is real trauma among these people. I mean, they've got memories, but they've lost everything else. And not just for the kids, but for the women as well. There's desperate fear that their husbands, their brothers, their fathers are in danger. Yeah. That's something that needs to be dealt with, but at least it can be dealt with for the refugees from a position of safety.
I want to ask about the UK, because you mentioned that the UK has come under pressure for only allowing about 1,000 refugees to go in to enter the country, and they do need a visa first as well. And now Boris Johnson has opened it up to talking about a possible second visa scheme that they're going to explain and introduce soon. What is the argument you would make to Boris Johnson and leaders of other countries who are reluctant to shelter more refugees? How is it in their self-interest to be more charitable?
Well, I think the first reason is a moral one, which is that when people are fleeing from war, you let them in first and you do the paperwork second, rather than the other way around. I think the second point that I would make is that the refugees will be desperate to go back to a peaceful Ukraine, but they're not able to do so. And while they're able to stay in the UK or anyone else, the adults are going to want to be able to contribute to the society that they're in. Thirdly, the UK should care about its reputation. And it's not good for the UK to be a laggard in this respect. It needs to catch up with the European Union. I've been arguing that all European countries, whether they're in the EU or not, and remember the UK, Norway, Switzerland are European countries that are not in the European Union, they need to be part of this Europe-wide effort to show real practical solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are fleeing from such an appalling conflict.
We started by talking about how we've entered this new phase of the war. Looking ahead to perhaps the next phase, the U.S. is now warning that Russia may deploy chemical, biological, or make good on its threat to use nuclear weapons as well. How is your organization, how is the IRC thinking through the kinds of preparations that can be made to prepare for the possibility of biowarfare?
Well, obviously, this is a terrifying prospect that we have only recent experience of in one theater, namely in Syria, where there was significant use of chemical weapons 8 or 9 years ago, and I'm afraid been repeated even as recently as 2019. So one's first thoughts are about what are the defenses for the personal defenses to protect staff, to protect clients. But the biggest defense has got to be the political pressure against the use of chemical weapons. That's an important role for China in this, because there's a global conventions against the use of chemical weapons. There's an organization for the prevention of the use of chemical weapons, the OPCW, that recently won the Nobel Peace Prize, actually. And so there's a great global need to say that the lines in the sand that have been drawn over the use of chemical weapons, over the use of biological weapons, over the use of nuclear weapons must be upheld, because the alternative is anarchy.